The valley stretched wide, a dry land between two towering hills. On one side, the mighty army of Israel stood, their tents lined up in rows, their banners hanging still in the morning air. On the other side, the Philistine army waited, their iron weapons gleaming under the rising sun. Among the Israelites, men whispered anxiously, shifting from foot to foot, their hands gripping their swords but making no move to fight. Fear gripped their hearts. For 40 days, the Philistine giant had stood before them, taunting, mocking, calling for a champion to face him. But no man dared to step forward. Goliath. His name alone sent chills through the camp. He was unlike any warrior they had ever seen, taller than any man, his armor heavy, his spear thick as a weaver's beam. His voice thundered across the valley as he bellowed once more, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man to fight me. If he can kill me, we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will serve us." No answer came from the Israelite side. The men of war looked away, some pretending to be busy with their armor, others shifting nervously. Even King Saul, once mighty in battle, sat in his tent, troubled, uncertain. Far from the battlefield, in the hills of Bethlehem, a young shepherd named David walked through the pastures, his staff in one hand, a sling hanging from his belt. His sheep moved lazily across the grass as he hummed a tune, his heart at peace. He had no sword, no shield, no armor, only the quiet strength of a boy who had spent years under the open sky, watching over his father's flock. That morning, his father Jesse called him from the fields. "David, take this bread and grain to your brothers in the army. And take these cheeses to their commander. See how your brothers are doing and bring back word." David's heart quickened. The battlefield. He had heard the stories, had seen the soldiers march off to war. His older brothers were among them, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, strong men, trained warriors. They had gone to fight for Israel, to serve their king. He hurried to gather the food, slinging the sack over his shoulder. He had no idea that the journey ahead would change everything. David set out early the next morning, leaving the sheep with a trusted hand. The sun was just beginning to warm the hills as he walked, the bag of bread and grain slung over his back. The road to the battlefield was long, but David moved with eager steps, his heart full of anticipation. When he reached the Israelite camp, the air was thick with tension. Soldiers stood in clusters, speaking in hushed tones. Some sat sharpening their swords, though their faces were filled with doubt. Others simply stared toward the valley, where the Philistine army waited. David wove through them, searching for his brothers. Then a voice boomed across the valley, shaking the ground like distant thunder. "Choose a man to fight me." David stopped, his breath caught in his chest. He turned to see the giant standing on the battlefield, towering over every man. Goliath's armor glinted in the sun, his spear like a massive tree branch in his hand. The sight of him sent shudders through the Israelite ranks, and David saw grown men stepping back, their faces pale. "What is this?" David asked a soldier nearby. "Why is no one answering him?" The man scoffed. "Because he's a giant. Every day he comes out, challenging us. No one dares fight him." David frowned. "And what does the king offer the man who defeats him?" "The king has promised riches," another soldier said. "And his daughter in marriage. And his family will never have to pay taxes again." David's eyes narrowed as he looked back at the Philistine. "And yet no one steps forward?" His words reached his eldest brother, Eliab, who turned sharply. "What are you doing here?" Eliab's face was flushed with frustration. "Shouldn't you be watching those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride. You only came to watch the battle." David met his brother's glare. "What have I done now? I only asked a question." Ignoring Eliab's anger, David turned to another soldier and repeated his question. Word spread quickly, and soon someone brought him before King Saul. David stood before the troubled king, his eyes steady. "Let no man lose heart because of this Philistine. I will fight him." Saul looked at him, surprised. "You are only a boy." He has been a warrior since his youth. David lifted his chin. "I have fought lions and bears when they came after my father's sheep. The Lord who rescued me from their paws will rescue me from this Philistine." Saul studied him for a long moment. Then, with a slow nod, he said, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Saul took his own armor and placed it on David. The bronze helmet wobbled on his head, the heavy coat of mail dragged at his shoulders. He took a few steps, but his movements were stiff, unnatural. David shook his head. "I can't wear this. I'm not used to it." He removed the armor, letting it drop with a dull thud. Then he turned and walked toward the stream that ran through the valley. The soldiers watched, murmuring among themselves, unsure whether to feel admiration or pity. David knelt by the water, his hands skimming the smooth stones beneath the surface. Carefully, he chose 5, each one fitting perfectly into the palm of his hand. He placed them in the pouch at his side and gripped his sling. With steady steps, he made his way toward the battlefield. Goliath stood waiting, his massive form casting a long shadow over the ground. As David approached, the giant's laughter rolled across the valley. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" Goliath sneered, his voice filled with contempt. "Come here, and I will feed your flesh to the birds and wild animals." David stopped a short distance away, his grip firm on his sling. He met the giant's gaze, his voice strong and unwavering. "You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. Today he will deliver you into my hands, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." The Philistine's grin faded. His eyes darkened with anger. He stomped forward, raising his massive spear. But David was already moving, his feet light, his hands swift. He reached into his pouch, pulled out a stone, and placed it in his sling. The battle was about to begin. The giant moved forward, each step sending tremors through the ground. His armor clanked, his massive spear gleaming in the sun. The Philistine army roared behind him, their voices echoing across the valley. They were certain of victory. David, standing small in comparison, did not waver. His fingers tightened around the sling as he took a step forward, his heart steady. Goliath raised his spear, preparing to strike, but David was already in motion. He swung the sling over his head, the leather strap whistling through the air. With practiced skill, he released the stone. It flew fast, cutting through the space between them. In an instant, the stone struck Goliath's forehead with a force that sent a sharp crack through the battlefield. The giant's mocking expression froze. His body swayed, his weapon slipping from his grasp. Then, like a falling tree, he crashed face-first into the dirt. Silence swallowed the valley. The Philistine army, moments before so confident, stood in stunned disbelief. The Israelites, who had trembled for days, watched with wide eyes. David exhaled but did not hesitate. He ran forward, reaching the fallen giant. With both hands, he grasped Goliath's massive sword, its weight unfamiliar but manageable. He raised it high and brought it down, ending the battle in one swift stroke. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, from the Israelite camp, a triumphant cry rang out. The soldiers erupted in shouts, their fear replaced with courage. The Philistines, realizing their champion was dead, turned and fled in terror. Victory belonged to Israel. The young shepherd had done what no warrior had dared. And the name of the Lord was lifted high among the people. The Philistines ran in terror, their mighty army now scattered like dry leaves in the wind. Israelite soldiers, once trembling with fear, surged forward with renewed strength, chasing after their fleeing enemies. The shouts of victory echoed through the valley, and the once hopeless battlefield became a place of triumph. David stood over Goliath's fallen body, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. Blood stained the ground, but in his heart there was no pride, only the certainty that the Lord had given him this victory. He reached down, grasped the giant's head by the hair, and lifted it for all to see. The sight sent another wave of fear through the Philistine ranks, and they fled even faster. Israel's warriors pursued them all the way to the gates of Ekron and Gath, striking down those who could not escape. When the battle was done, they returned and plundered the abandoned Philistine camp, taking what had been left behind in the enemy's haste to escape. David, still holding the giant's head, made his way back toward the Israelite camp. The men moved aside as he passed, their eyes filled with awe. He was no longer just a shepherd. He was the one who had done what no soldier, not even the king, had dared. As he entered the camp, a messenger ran ahead to King Saul. The king, who had watched the battle unfold from a distance, sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. "Whose son is this young man?" he asked his commander, Abner. Abner, still shaken by what he had witnessed, shook his head. "As surely as you live, my king, I do not know." "Find out," Saul ordered. Minutes later, David stood before the king, still holding Goliath's head. His face was calm, his stance unwavering. Saul studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Whose son are you, young man?" David met the king's gaze. "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." The words hung in the air. Saul had called for warriors, for trained men of battle, for those who had experience in war. But victory had come through a shepherd boy. And though no one knew it yet, this was only the beginning of David's story. The victory over Goliath spread quickly throughout Israel. The people, once paralyzed by fear, now held their heads high. Whispers of the shepherd boy who had defeated the giant turned into loud praises. Songs were sung, and David's name was spoken with admiration in every town and village. As the army returned home, the streets were filled with celebration. Women came out dancing, their voices lifted in joy. They sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." King Saul, riding at the front of the procession, heard the words. His jaw tightened, his grip on the reins firm. At first, he had welcomed David as a hero. But now, something stirred inside him, a sharp sting of jealousy. The people were praising David more than their king. The thought burned in his mind. That night, as the feast in the royal hall carried on, Saul watched David closely. The young warrior sat among the king's men, his face lit with laughter, unaware of the storm brewing in Saul's heart. The next day, a troubling spirit came over Saul. His thoughts turned dark, his anger growing without reason. He sat in his chamber, gripping his spear tightly. David entered, as he often did, with his harp in hand. The soft notes filled the room, easing the tension in the air. But Saul's jealousy had taken root, twisting his mind. In a sudden burst of rage, Saul hurled his spear at David. The sharp point struck the wall, just missing him. David's breath caught, his body tensed, but he did not retaliate. Instead, he stepped back, his heart pounding. Saul said nothing. He only stared, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. David met his gaze for a moment before turning and walking away. He did not need to be told that things had changed. That night, as David lay in bed, his thoughts swirled. He had fought lions and bears, stood before a giant without fear. But now, he faced something far more dangerous, the jealousy of a king. The days that followed were uneasy. David remained in the king's service, but he no longer felt safe. Saul's mood shifted like a stormy sky. One moment, he spoke with kindness, and the next, his eyes burned with envy. The spear that had been thrown at him still lodged in the wall of David's mind. Yet, David did not leave. He had been given command over Saul's army, and with each battle, his fame grew. The people loved him, the soldiers trusted him, and even Saul's own son, Jonathan, became his closest friend. Jonathan, noble and loyal, saw in David a heart devoted to God, and the two formed a bond stronger than blood. One evening, as David returned victorious from battle, Saul watched him with darkened eyes. The cheers of the people rang through the streets, their voices lifted in praise of David. Saul clenched his fists. The fear inside him deepened, fear that this young warrior would take his throne. Saul plotted in silence. He offered David his eldest daughter in marriage, hoping to entangle him in royal duties, to control him. But David humbly declined, saying, "Who am I, and what is my family, that I should become the king's son-in-law?" Saul was undeterred. When his younger daughter, Michal, fell in love with David, the king saw another chance. He set a bride price, not gold or land, but the defeat of 100 Philistines. He was certain David would fall in battle. But David did not. He went out with his men and returned victorious. Michal became his wife, and Saul's fear turned to hatred. The king's heart was set against David now. He sent men to watch his house, to seize him in the night. But Michal warned her husband, "You must leave now, or by morning you will be killed." David did not hesitate. He climbed through the window and vanished into the darkness. The city that had once celebrated him now held dangers at every turn. With nothing but the clothes on his back and the faith in his heart, he fled into the wilderness, a hunted man. David ran through the night, his heart pounding as he left the city behind. The stars above him shone brightly, but his path was uncertain. He had been a hero, a commander, the king's son-in-law, but now he was a fugitive. His first stop was Nob, where the priests of the Lord served. Weary and hungry, he entered the house of God, where Ahimelech, the priest, looked at him with concern. "Why are you alone?" Ahimelech asked, sensing something was wrong. David hesitated. He could not reveal the full truth. "The king sent me on a secret mission," he said. "I left in haste and brought no food or weapon." Ahimelech nodded and gestured toward the sacred bread, the only food available. "Take it," he said. "The bread is holy, but you may eat it if you have kept yourselves pure." David accepted the bread gratefully, knowing it was the Lord's provision. But he needed more than food. "Do you have a weapon here?" he asked. The priest pointed to a cloth-wrapped bundle behind the altar. "The sword of Goliath, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. If you wish to take it, do so." David unwrapped the weapon, his fingers brushing against the familiar hilt. He lifted the heavy blade, the same sword he had used to end the giant's life. "There is none like it," he murmured. "I will take it." But danger was already closing in. One of Saul's men had been at Nob that day, a servant named Doug, who had watched the exchange with quiet interest. David did not know it yet, but his presence in Nob would bring great suffering to the priests. With food in his pack and a weapon at his side, David fled once more. He could not return home. He could not seek shelter among his people. And so, in desperation, he did the unthinkable. He ran to the land of the Philistines, to the city of Gath, the very place Goliath had once called home. The moment he arrived, whispers spread through the streets. The Philistine king's men seized him, dragging him before Achish, their ruler. "Is this not David, the one they sing about? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." David's heart pounded. He was in enemy hands. If they realized who he truly was, they would surely kill him. So, he made a choice. He let his body shake, let drool run down his beard, and scratched at the doors like a madman. His eyes darted wildly, his mouth muttering nonsense. The Philistine king recoiled in disgust. "Why have you brought me this fool?" Achish scoffed. "Do I lack madmen that you bring me another?" With a wave of his hand, he ordered David to be thrown out. And so, David escaped once more, alone, without a home, but still held by the hand of God. David fled into the wilderness, his mind racing. He had no home, no army, no place of safety. But he was not alone for long. When his brothers and his father's household heard where he was, they came to him. And they were not the only ones. Men who were in distress, those in debt, and those discontented with life gathered around him. They had no leader, no purpose, until now. David became their commander, and from that moment, the wilderness became their refuge. 400 men stood with him, a band of outcasts turned into warriors. They moved from place to place, hiding from Saul's pursuit. But David's heart was not set on rebellion. He would not raise his hand against the king, even as Saul's hatred burned hotter with each passing day. One day, David led his men to Moab and sought shelter for his parents. "Let my father and mother stay with you until I know what God will do for me," he pleaded with the king of Moab. The ruler agreed, and David's family was safe for now. But David could not stay. The prophet Gad came to him with a word from the Lord. "Do not stay in the stronghold. Go to the land of Judah." And so, David moved again, deeper into Saul's territory, knowing that danger was never far behind. Meanwhile, Saul's rage had reached its peak. He sat under a tree, his spear in hand, his commanders gathered around him. "Why have none of you told me that my own son has made a covenant with David?" he shouted. "No one cares for me. No one tells me when my enemy is plotting against me." Then, a voice broke through the silence. Doeg, the Edomite, stepped forward. "I saw David in Nob," he said. "He was with Ahimelech, the priest. Ahimelech gave him food and the sword of Goliath." Saul's eyes darkened. He sent for Ahimelech and all the priests of Nob. When they arrived, he glared at them. "Why have you conspired against me?" he demanded. "You gave David bread and a weapon. You helped my enemy." Ahimelech shook his head. "Who among your servants is as loyal as David? He has always served you faithfully. I did nothing wrong." But Saul would not listen. In his blind fury, he ordered the death of the priests. His men hesitated, unwilling to strike down the Lord's servants. But Doeg did not hesitate. He stepped forward and slaughtered them all. Word of the massacre reached David, and his heart was heavy. One of the priests, Abiathar, escaped and came to him. "Saul has killed the priests of the Lord," he said, his voice filled with grief. David's hands clenched into fists. "I knew when I saw Doeg in Nob that this would happen," he said. "Stay with me. You will be safe here." The weight of Saul's wrath grew heavier, but David's faith did not waver. He had no throne, no kingdom, and no home. But he had the Lord. And that was enough. David and his men moved through the wilderness of Keilah, always watchful, always on the move. They were warriors now, but not outlaws. They fought not for plunder, but for the people of Israel. News came that the Philistines were attacking Keilah, stealing grain and destroying the land. David's heart stirred at the thought of his people suffering. He turned to the Lord. "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" The answer came clearly. "Go, attack the Philistines and save Keilah." But David's men hesitated. "We are already hunted by Saul," they said. "If we go against the Philistines, won't we be even more vulnerable?" David asked the Lord again, and the answer was the same. "Go, for I will give the Philistines into your hand." Trusting in God, David and his men marched to Keilah. They struck down the Philistines, saving the city and its people. But the victory was short-lived. Word reached Saul that David was in Keilah, and the king saw an opportunity. "God has delivered him into my hands," he thought. "He has trapped himself in a city with gates and bars." Saul gathered his forces and prepared to march. David, hearing of Saul's plans, turned once more to the Lord. "Will the people of Keilah hand me over to Saul?" he asked. The answer was painful. They will. Though David had saved them, fear ruled their hearts. Knowing he could not stay, David and his men slipped away before Saul arrived, vanishing into the wilderness once more. They wandered through the strongholds of Ziph and Maon, moving carefully, always pursued. But in this dark time, David found unexpected strength. Jonathan, Saul's son, came to him in the wilderness. "Do not be afraid," Jonathan said, grasping David's hand. "My father will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be at your side." David's heart swelled with gratitude. They made a covenant before the Lord, a bond unbroken by war or jealousy. Then Jonathan returned home, and David continued his flight. But Saul was closing in. The Ziphites, seeking favor with the king, revealed David's location. Saul and his men pursued him relentlessly. At one point, they were only a hillside away, ready to close in for the kill. Then, suddenly, a messenger arrived. "Hurry! The Philistines are attacking the land." Saul cursed under his breath, but had no choice. He abandoned the chase and turned back to fight the Philistines. David exhaled, his heart still racing. He had been moments from capture, but once again, the Lord had delivered him. With renewed faith, he led his men deeper into the wilderness, knowing that the battle was far from over. David and his men settled in the strongholds of En-Gedi, where caves and rocky cliffs provided shelter. The pursuit had not ended, but for now they had a moment of rest. Saul, however, did not give up. As soon as he finished fighting the Philistines, he gathered 3,000 of his best men and set out again, determined to find David and put an end to him once and for all. One day, as Saul's army moved through the wilderness, the king stepped away from his men to rest in a cave. Unbeknownst to him, David and his men were hiding in the very same cave, concealed in the darkness. David's men whispered urgently, "This is the day the Lord spoke of. He has delivered your enemy into your hands. Strike him down." David moved forward, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He crept silently toward the king, his dagger in hand. But as he neared Saul, something inside him held him back. Instead of killing the king, David reached out and cut off a piece of Saul's robe. The moment he did, his heart was troubled. He turned to his men and whispered, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed. I will not lay my hand on him." Saul, unaware of how close he had come to death, left the cave and continued down the path. As soon as he was a safe distance away, David stepped out into the open and called after him, "My lord, the king." Saul turned, startled. There stood David, holding up the piece of his robe. "Why do you listen to those who say I seek to harm you?" David's voice rang across the valley. "Today, the Lord placed you in my hands. My men urged me to kill you, but I spared your life. See, my father, the corner of your robe in my hand. If I meant you harm, you would not be standing here now." Saul stared at David, his expression shifting. His face softened, and his voice trembled. "Is that your voice, David, my son?" Tears filled his eyes as he spoke. "You are more righteous than I. You have treated me well, though I have treated you badly. May the Lord reward you for the kindness you have shown me today. I know that you will surely be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands." Saul lifted his gaze, a plea in his voice. "Swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or destroy my name from my father's house." David swore the oath, and with that, Saul turned and left with his men. But David did not return with him. He knew Saul's heart was unstable, and he could not trust his words. Instead, he and his men remained in the wilderness, still fugitives, still waiting for the day the Lord would fulfill his promise. Time passed, and David remained in the wilderness, moving from place to place. Though Saul had wept and spoken of peace, his heart had not truly changed. Soon the hunt for David resumed, and the king's fury burned hotter than before. One night, word came that Saul had set up camp nearby. He and his army slept under the open sky, his men spread out around him, his spear planted firmly in the ground beside him. David watched from a distance. Then he turned to Abishai, one of his most loyal warriors. "Who will go down with me into Saul's camp?" Abishai's eyes gleamed. "I will go with you." Together they moved through the darkness, slipping past the sleeping guards. Saul lay in the center of the camp, his spear beside him, his men resting around him. Abishai whispered, "Today, God has given your enemy into your hands. Let me strike him with his own spear. I will not need to strike twice." David shook his head. "Do not destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? The Lord himself will deal with him in his time." Instead of taking Saul's life, David reached down and took the king's spear and his water jug. Then, just as silently as they had entered, they slipped away into the night. When they were a safe distance from the camp, David climbed to the top of a hill and called out, "Abner, are you not a man? Why have you failed to guard your king?" The camp stirred, men scrambling to their feet. Saul sat up, blinking in the dim light. David lifted the spear. "Where is the king's spear and the jug of water that was beside him?" Saul's voice rang out. "Is that your voice, David, my son?" David's voice was firm but sorrowful. "Why does my Lord pursue his servant? What have I done? If the Lord has stirred you against me, let him accept an offering. But if men have done this, may they be cursed. Must I be driven from the Lord's inheritance like a man told to serve other gods?" Saul sighed deeply. "I have sinned," he admitted. "Come back, David, for I will no longer try to harm you. Today you valued my life, so may my life be precious in the Lord's sight." David was not fooled. He knew Saul's change of heart would not last. He answered, "Here is your spear. Send one of your men to retrieve it. The Lord rewards each man for his righteousness and faithfulness. Though he gave you into my hands, I would not harm you. May he deliver me from all trouble." Saul's voice carried across the valley. "May you be blessed, David, my son. You will do great things and surely triumph." And with that, Saul and his army turned away, leaving David once more. But David did not return to his land. He knew as long as Saul lived, he would never be safe. And so, he made a desperate decision: he would go to the Philistines. David and his men traveled to the land of the Philistines, seeking refuge where they had once been enemies. He approached Achish, the king of Gath, and made his request. "If I have found favor in your sight, grant me a place in one of the country towns," David said. "There is no need for your servant to live in the royal city." Achish, seeing no threat in David, granted him the town of Ziklag. There, David and his men settled with their families, safe from Saul's pursuit. For over a year they lived among the Philistines, but David was no traitor. While he appeared to serve Achish, he led his men in secret raids against the enemies of Israel, Amalekites, Geshurites, and Girzites, leaving no survivors to report the truth. When Achish asked where he had raided, David misled him, making him believe he had attacked his own people. Achish trusted David completely. He has made himself an enemy of Israel, he thought. He will serve me forever. Then came a day when the Philistines gathered their armies to war against Israel. Achish summoned David. "You and your men will march with me." David nodded, his expression unreadable. "You will see what your servant can do." But the other Philistine commanders were uneasy. "Is this not David, the one they sing about? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. He must not go with us. In battle, he might turn against us to regain Saul's favor." Achish pleaded on David's behalf, but the commanders would not be swayed. At last, Achish relented. Return to Ziklag, he told David. You have been upright in my sight, but the other rulers do not trust you. David and his men set out for home, relieved that they would not have to fight their own people. But as they neared Ziklag, dread filled their hearts. Smoke rose in the distance. The town lay in ruins. The Amalekites had attacked in their absence, burning their homes and taking their wives and children captive. A wail of anguish rose from David's men. They fell to the ground, weeping until they had no strength left. Bitterness filled their hearts, and they turned to David in fury. "This is your fault," some shouted. "We should stone you." David's heart ached, but he did not fall into despair. He turned to the Lord. "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?" The answer came swiftly. "Pursue them, for you will surely overtake them and succeed in the rescue." With renewed strength, David and his men set out, determined to recover what had been stolen. The battle was not over, and David would not stop until his people were safe once more. David and his men rode hard, their hearts burning with determination. As they pursued the Amalekites, they came upon a man left behind in the wilderness, a weary Egyptian servant, abandoned by his master. David's men gave him food and water, reviving his strength. "Who do you belong to?" David asked. "I was with the Amalekites," the man admitted. "We raided Ziklag, but my master left me behind when I fell ill." David leaned forward. "Can you lead us to them?" The man nodded. "Swear by God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you to them." David swore the oath, and the man led them straight to the Amalekite camp. The raiders were scattered, feasting and drinking, celebrating their victory. David wasted no time. At his command, his men charged, striking down the Amalekites from dusk until the next evening. Not one escaped except 400 young men who fled on camels. Every captive was rescued, wives, sons, daughters, not one was harmed. Every stolen possession was recovered, and even more was taken from the Amalekite spoils. David and his men rejoiced, for the Lord had given them victory. As they returned, they met the 200 men who had stayed behind, too exhausted to continue the pursuit. Some of the warriors who had fought sneered, "They did not fight with us. They should not share in the plunder." But David rebuked them. "No, my brothers. The Lord has given us this victory. Who are we to withhold his blessing? The share of those who stayed behind will be the same as those who fought." From that day, it became a law in Israel, those who guarded the supplies would share in the rewards of battle. Meanwhile, far from Ziklag, another battle raged. The Philistines had clashed with Israel, and Saul's army was in ruins. His sons, including Jonathan, had fallen. Wounded and surrounded, Saul knew the end had come. Rather than be taken by the enemy, he fell on his own sword, ending his reign in tragedy. 3 days later, a messenger arrived in Ziklag with torn clothes and dust on his head. He knelt before David and spoke trembling words. "Saul and Jonathan are dead." David tore his clothes, weeping aloud. His men mourned with him. That night, David lamented, his voice rising in sorrow. "How the mighty have fallen! The beauty of Israel lies slain on your heights. Jonathan, my brother, your love for me was wonderful, more than that of women. How the mighty have fallen! And the weapons of war have perished." Though Saul had hunted him, David did not rejoice in his death. He grieved for the fallen king and his beloved friend. But even in mourning, a new chapter had begun. The time of wandering was over. The Lord's promise would soon be fulfilled. David was about to become king.